Who's the scariest person you've ever seen in real life? My friend Naomi begged me to sit with her during her dad's final hours because she couldn't face it alone. She warned me her brother Carl was flying in and had a violent temper. She hadn't seen him in 5 years since he was banned from family events. In the hospice room, her dad was unconscious after a sudden stroke 2 days ago, left him unable to speak or move, though his eyes kept moving under the lids like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. Naomi whispered that Carl's flight had just landed and he would arrive by 2. Her dad's heart monitor spiked dramatically, and spiked even further when Naomi mentioned it was 11:30. It eventually settled, but by then it was noon, and Naomi was already getting rapid-fire texts from Carl saying he was on his way. She kept checking the door every few seconds like she expected something terrible to walk through. Her dad's breathing became more labored and raspy, prompting the nurse to come check his morphine levels, but when she reached to increase the dosage, his hand suddenly clamped down on Naomi's wrist with shocking strength. His eyes snapped open for the first time since the stroke hit, wild and unfocused but definitely aware of where he was, and his mouth worked desperately like he was screaming without any sound coming out. The nurse insisted it was just involuntary muscle spasms that happened sometimes near the end. At 1 o'clock, Carl texted that he was 20 minutes away. Naomi's dad grew increasingly agitated, his heart rate climbing into dangerous territory as he tried to lift his head off the pillow. Naomi begged him to save his energy and rest, but he kept staring at the door, then back at her face, his cracked lips forming the same shapes over and over again. She fumbled for a notepad from the bedside table and pressed a pen into his trembling fingers, but his hands were too weak to grip it properly. He managed to scratch out a shaky letter C before the pen rolled away across the white hospital blanket. Naomi started crying harder, saying, "I know you want to see Carl before you go. He's almost here, Daddy. Just hold on a little bit longer." Carl walked through the doorway at exactly 1:30, and every machine in that room started alarming at once. He was bigger than I expected, easily 6'4" with shoulders that barely cleared the doorframe, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the prison tattoos crawling up his thick neck. He hadn't even looked at his dying father yet, just stared at Naomi with cold eyes and said, "Jesus Christ, Naomi, you got fat just like Mom." Then he strode to the bed and grabbed his dad's fragile hand in his massive fist, squeezing hard enough that I saw the old man wince in obvious pain. "Hey there, Pops. Did you miss your favorite son?" he said with a smile that never touched his eyes, and his dad's expression transformed into something that looked exactly like terror. Carl launched into a monologue about how he'd always been Daddy's golden boy before Naomi poisoned their father against him with her endless lies and manipulations. He squeezed his dad's hand harder with each accusation, saying Naomi had stolen everything that belonged to him, turned the entire extended family against him. The heart monitor was shrieking continuously now, and Naomi reached for the nurse call button, but Carl casually yanked it straight out of the wall socket before she could press it. "We're having quality family time here," he said in a voice so calm it made the hair on my neck stand up. Their dad was desperately trying to speak now, reaching toward Naomi with his free hand, while Carl maintained that crushing grip on the other one. Carl leaned down close to his dad's face and whispered something I couldn't hear from where I was sitting, but whatever he said made the old man start thrashing violently against the bed rails. Naomi tried pulling Carl's arm away, but he shoved her backward into the wall hard enough to knock a framed photo to the floor where it shattered. I jumped up to help, but Carl turned those dead eyes on me and said, "Sit your ass back down or you'll need a bed right next to his," nodding toward the dying man who was still struggling. The nurse came in, and Carl transformed instantly into the perfect grieving son. The second she left the room, he went right back to crushing his father's brittle hand while talking about that night 5 years ago when everything changed between them. The old man was crying now, actual tears rolling down his sunken cheeks. Carl's phone rang and he stepped into the hallway to take the call, warning us not to move 1 inch while he was gone. The instant he disappeared around the corner, Naomi's dad grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and pulled me close to his face. His voice was nothing but air escaping his lungs, but I could read his lips as he mouthed the same thing repeatedly. I grabbed the notepad and wrapped his fingers around the pen, supporting his trembling hand as he scratched out several shaky letters. Carl walked back in just as his dad finished writing the last letter. The old man's hand went completely limp, and the heart monitor flatlined into one continuous shriek. Carl rushed to the bed, suddenly the devastated son again as nurses flooded into the room with the crash cart. I looked down at the notepad clutched in my hand where his father had written, "Carl poisoned me." The crash team pushed past us and started working on him, pumping his chest and injecting stuff into his IV, while I stood there clutching that notepad against my chest so hard my knuckles turned white. Carl switched into perfect grieving son mode instantly, tears streaming down his face as he stepped back to give them room, his massive frame shaking with what looked like genuine sobs. The nurses worked for 20 minutes straight, switching out who did compressions every few minutes while the machines kept screaming, and the whole time I kept that paper pressed against me, terrified someone would see what his dad had written. When they finally stopped and the doctor called time of death at 2:17 p.m., I slipped the notepad into my pocket while everyone was focused on Carl collapsing into a chair with his head in his hands. He looked up at Naomi with red eyes and pulled her into a crushing hug that made her whole body go stiff like a board. "At least we were both here when Dad passed," he said loud enough for all the nurses to hear, and over his shoulder I saw Naomi's eyes go wide with panic, her arms hanging limp at her sides instead of hugging him back. The hospice director showed up within minutes with a clipboard full of paperwork, and Carl jumped up to take charge immediately, signing forms and making decisions about the funeral home, while Naomi sat frozen in her chair staring at nothing. I pulled out my phone and texted her asking if she wanted to step outside for some air, but she shook her head just barely, too scared to leave Carl alone with any of the officials who might ask questions. Carl kept talking to the director about how sudden this all was, how his dad had been doing so well just yesterday according to the nurses, putting on this whole show of confused grief that made my skin crawl. We finally got out to the parking lot an hour later, and Naomi completely fell apart, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe while gripping my arms. "Please don't go to the police yet," she begged between gasps. "I need time to think about this. I need to figure out what to do." I pulled the notepad from my pocket and showed her the shaky letters again, watching her trace her finger over her dad's handwriting, while tears dripped onto the paper. "This could be wrong," she whispered. "Maybe he was confused from the medication. Maybe Carl didn't actually do anything." But we both knew she didn't believe that. Not after seeing how her dad reacted when Carl walked in. Not after watching Carl yank that call button from the wall. That evening I sat in my apartment checking every lock twice and pulling my curtains closed, knowing Carl had seen me there, knowing he'd watched me help his dad write those words. My hands shook as I picked up my phone and called the police non-emergency line, asking in a whisper if I could speak to someone about a suspicious death at the hospice. Detective Dexter Hardy Hardy showed up at my door within an hour. This calm, older guy with gray hair who put on latex gloves before taking the notepad from my shaking hands. He sat at my kitchen table asking me detailed questions about everything, writing down every single thing I remembered about Carl yanking the call button, about the dad's terror. When Carl walked in, about those 40 minutes Carl was supposedly on his way from the airport, Hardy bagged the notepad in an evidence bag and told me they'd need to do an autopsy, that this kind of accusation in a hospice setting was complicated, but they took it seriously. My phone rang while he was still there, and it was Naomi crying again, saying Carl kept texting her about funeral arrangements and asking why the body hadn't been released to the funeral home yet. I haven't told him about the police, she sobbed, but he's going to figure it out soon. He always figures everything out. Hardy asked to speak with her, and spent 10 minutes on my phone telling her to document every text and call from Carl, to save everything. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Carl that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. I know what you told them. Lying about a grieving son is a new low. I screenshot it immediately and forwarded it to Hardy, who called me right back and told me to document everything, to vary my routes to work, to stay aware of my surroundings at all times. That same afternoon, Hardy called to tell me that nurse Darla Palmer had contacted him to file an official incident report about Carl yanking the call button from the wall. She'd been working hospice for 15 years and had never seen a family member do something like that. Plus, she mentioned how the father's heart rate had spiked so dramatically when Carl's name was mentioned, something she'd never witnessed before in all her years. I wonder what's really going through Carl's mind when he walks in and immediately insults his sister, instead of looking at his dying father. There's something strange about how the dad tried to write that letter C earlier, then later manages to write the full. Hardy had already gotten the hospice security footage and discovered something huge. Carl had actually been in the building for 40 minutes before he showed up in the room, his keycard showing he'd entered through the staff entrance at 12:50 p.m. The medication logs from that morning showed an unusual pattern too, with someone accessing the medication room around the time Carl was in the building, though nothing conclusive enough for an arrest yet. 2 days later, the medical examiner's office called about putting an official hold on the body. Dr. Zara Aurora explained over the phone that this meant Carl couldn't push for immediate cremation like he'd been demanding. Naomi met me at the office to sign the paperwork, and her hands shook so bad she could barely hold the pen. She kept looking over her shoulder like Carl might walk in any second. The forms were thick and full of legal words, but basically said they needed to do a full autopsy. Naomi's phone started ringing while we were still there, and Carl's name flashed on the screen. She put it on speaker, and his voice filled the small office, all smooth and concerned sounding. He said we were dishonoring their father's memory by delaying the funeral. Then he mentioned how grief makes people imagine things and see things that aren't really there. I watched Naomi's face crumble a little bit as he kept talking about how the family needed closure. After she hung up, we went down to the basement where Dr. Aurora was starting the preliminary examination. She had cameras set up everywhere and was taking pictures of every single inch of the body. She showed us how she was documenting all the IV sites and looking for any injection marks that shouldn't be there. On his torso, she found 3 small puncture wounds that didn't match any of the official IV locations from his medical chart. She found 2 more on his upper arms that looked fresh but weren't documented anywhere. The next morning, I had to meet with a victim's advocate at the courthouse. She was this older woman who'd seen everything, and she walked me through what would happen next. She helped me fill out paperwork for a restraining order against Carl and explained how these cases usually go. She warned me that witness intimidation happens all the time in family murder cases. Then she showed me this app on my phone that works like a panic button if Carl shows up. While I was there, Detective Hardy called with huge news. He'd been digging into Carl's background and discovered Carl got out of prison just 8 months ago. The charge was aggravated assault, and the family had no idea because Carl never told them. Hardy said he was keeping this out of the media for now, but he'd found a pattern going back 15 years. There were arrests for battery, assault, threatening behavior, all kinds of violent stuff. Hardy showed me this timeline he'd created using all of Carl's own texts about when his flight landed and when he'd arrived. The visitor log at the hospice showed Carl badged in at exactly 1:30 p.m., which matched what we saw. The official time of death was 2:47 p.m., and the timeline showed Carl was alone with his father for those crucial 40 minutes before showing up in the room. Everything lined up perfectly with when Carl could have done something to his father. I went with Naomi to meet the prosecutor assigned to the case. Assistant District Attorney Hamilton Pope was this tall, thin guy who looked tired already. He spread out all the evidence on his desk and explained the problem we were facing. He said proving murder in a hospice setting was incredibly hard because people are already dying. He needed the full autopsy results before he could make any charging decisions. The toxicology samples were being collected that same day. Dr. Aurora called us down to observe while she extracted fluid from the father's eyes. She explained this vitreous fluid could show blood sugar levels at the exact time of death. If someone used insulin as a weapon, it would cause the blood sugar to crash fatally low. She said this test was one of the best ways to catch insulin poisoning. While we waited for results, Darla Palmer came to the police station to give more details. She told Hardy about how the father's grip on Naomi's wrist was way too strong for someone supposedly paralyzed. She said in 15 years of hospice work, she'd never seen anything like it. She also mentioned that someone had requested a morphine increase that morning, but when she tried to give it, the father had that strong reaction. She checked the logs, and the request came from the medication room terminal, but there was no name attached. Hardy started digging into the hospice pharmacy records from the week before the death. The audit showed something weird that made everyone pay attention. An extra insulin pen had been logged into the refrigerator, but there was no patient name on it. The security footage from the pharmacy area for that whole week was corrupted, and nobody could explain why. The IT department said it looked like someone had deliberately damaged the files. This was getting bigger than just Carl and his father. Someone with access to the hospice systems was helping cover tracks. Hardy started pulling records from every staff member who worked that week. He found 3 employees who'd been written up for protocol violations in the past year. One of them had been on duty the morning Carl arrived early. The more we dug into this, the scarier it got. Carl had planned this whole thing and might have had help from someone inside. Naomi was falling apart from the stress and stayed at my place most nights now. She couldn't go home because Carl kept showing up at her apartment even though he wasn't supposed to contact us. The investigation was moving, but it felt like Carl was always one step ahead of everyone. 3 days later, Naomi showed up at my door with her phone in her shaking hand. She pulled up a text thread between her and her dad from 3 months back. The messages showed he'd made her medical power of attorney and cut Carl completely out of the will. Her dad had sent her photos of the signed documents and everything. She kept saying she felt sick that money was part of this now. I told her it wasn't about the money but about control and Carl losing it. The next morning, Hardy called to warn us that Carl had hired some big shot defense attorney named Delaney Red. She'd already sent preservation letters to the hospice and police department. She was telling reporters that the police were harassing a grieving son. She kept pushing this story about natural death and family members who couldn't accept reality. Hardy said Reed was known for getting guilty people off on technicalities. That same afternoon, Carl left a voicemail on Hardy's phone that we all listened to together at the station. Carl claimed the morphine was killing his father and he was trying to save him by stopping the dose increase. His voice sounded rehearsed and fake. Hardy played us another voicemail from 2 days earlier where Carl said something completely different about just wanting quality time. Each story he told contradicted the last one. Hardy had gotten the security footage from the hospice hallway and the room entrance. We watched it frame by frame on his computer screen. You could see Carl yanking the call button straight out of the wall at exactly 1:47 p.m. Then at 1:48 when the nurse walked in, he instantly switched to crying and holding his dad's hand. Hardy said this video would destroy Carl's grieving son act in court. The way Carl transformed in 1 second was scary to watch. Dr. Aurora called us down to the morgue 2 days later for an update. She'd been examining every inch of the father's body with a magnifying glass. She found a tiny puncture wound on his lower abdomen that didn't match any of the documented IV sites. She measured it and took dozens of photos from different angles. She said it was exactly the right size for an insulin injection needle. The location was weird too, hidden in a skin fold where nobody would notice. Hardy brought the notepad to the crime lab to get it fingerprinted properly. The tech found my prints, Naomi's prints, and her father's prints all over it. Hardy explained that the defense would claim we contaminated the evidence by handling it. He walked me through exactly how I'd need to testify about the chain of custody. He made me practice describing every second from when the father wrote it until I gave it to police. A health aide named Maria came to the station saying she had information about that morning. She'd been restocking supplies and saw Carl standing by his father's IV pump around noon. His back was turned and his hands were moving near the tubes. She didn't think much about it then, but now she wondered if he was adding something. She remembered because Carl had snapped at her to give him privacy when she walked by. The housekeeping supervisor brought in a small plastic cap she'd found in the waste bin. It was from the hallway trash right outside the father's room. She'd found it while doing the deep clean after the death. It looked like a cap from an insulin pen needle. She'd saved it because something felt wrong about the whole situation that day. The crime lab tested the needle cap but couldn't get much from it. It matched a standard insulin pen that millions of people use for diabetes. There was no serial number or batch code to trace where it came from. They couldn't find any DNA or clear fingerprints on it either. Without that, it was just circumstantial evidence that could have come from anywhere. Ada Pope met with us to explain where the case stood legally. He said he wanted to wait for the complete toxicology results before making any arrest. Moving too fast could let Carl's lawyer tear the case apart on technical grounds. He knew we were frustrated but said patience now meant a stronger case later. He explained that hospice deaths were the hardest murders to prove. The insulin pen showing up in the system with no patient name makes me wonder who exactly has access to log medications like that. Carl's prison record being hidden from his family for 8 months seems oddly convenient. How does someone keep that kind of secret when background checks exist? Juries expect people to die in hospice, so proving someone accelerated it takes rock-solid evidence. While we waited for test results, Carl kept showing up places he shouldn't be. Naomi saw him parked outside her gym just watching her through the window. I spotted him at the grocery store 3 aisles over pretending to shop. He never approached us directly, so technically he wasn't breaking any laws. Hardy said Carl was trying to intimidate us without giving them anything they could arrest him for. The toxicology results started coming back piece by piece over the next 2 weeks. The blood work showed some abnormalities, but nothing definitive yet. The important test was the vitreous fluid from the eyes that Dr. Aurora had extracted. That would show the blood sugar level at the exact moment of death. If it was dangerously low, it would prove insulin poisoning. But those specialized tests took longer because they had to send them to a lab 3 states away. Every day that passed without an arrest made us more nervous about what Carl might do next. 2 days later, Carl's lawyer, Delaney Red, filed papers with the court trying to stop the autopsy photos from being released to the media. She went on 3 local news channels that same afternoon talking about how Carl was just a son grieving his father who died naturally from his stroke and heart problems. She kept saying our family was looking for someone to blame for their loss and picking on Carl because of old family drama. The next morning, I woke up to 47 notifications on my phone from people I didn't know, commenting on my social media accounts. A local blog had posted an article with our full names saying we were making up stories about Carl for attention and probably hoping to get money from a lawsuit. The comment section was full of people calling me a liar and saying I should be arrested for false accusations. Someone posted my work address saying people should go tell me what they thought of me in person. Another person found photos from my Instagram and posted them with nasty comments about how I looked. I spent 2 hours deleting my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts, but screenshots were already spreading around local Facebook groups. My boss called me into his office that afternoon because people were calling the store asking if they really employed someone who would lie about a man watching his father die. 3 days after the blog post, I was restocking shelves near the front windows when I saw Carl standing on the sidewalk outside. He was just standing there with his hands in his pockets, staring straight at me with this little smile on his face. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped the box of coffee filters I was holding. I walked to the back office and called 911 saying there was a man outside my workplace who I had a restraining order against. By the time the police showed up 20 minutes later, Carl was gone. The officer took my statement but said since Carl was on a public sidewalk and didn't come inside or make any threats, he hadn't technically broken any laws. I showed him photos I'd taken on my phone of Carl standing there, but he said that wasn't enough to arrest him. Detective Hardy called me that evening with some good news though. They'd gotten Carl's cell phone records and the data showed his phone connected to the hospice Wi-Fi network at 12:50 that day, 40 minutes before he walked into his dad's room. The phone stayed connected the whole time, which proved he was somewhere in the building all that time before showing up to see his father. The Wi-Fi logs backed this up completely, making it impossible for Carl to claim he'd just arrived when he walked into the room. The crime lab had also finished testing that needle cap the housekeeper found. They found partial DNA on it, but it was all mixed up with at least 3 different people's DNA and 2 degraded to match to anyone specific. Dr. Aurora explained to us that medical waste often has multiple DNA profiles on it from different staff members handling it, plus the cleaning chemicals break down the DNA. She documented everything anyway for the case file even though it wouldn't help in court. The preliminary toxicology report finally came back and Dr. Aurora called us in to explain what they found. The glucose level in the vitreous fluid from the father's eyes was dangerously low, way below what would be normal even for someone dying. She said this was consistent with insulin insulin overdose causing fatal hypoglycemia. The tricky part was that sometimes when organs are failing at the end of life, glucose levels can drop naturally, but not usually this low. Combined with everything else, she said homicide was probable, but a good defense lawyer could argue it was natural. That night, Naomi finally told me the whole story about their family that she'd been too ashamed to share before. Their dad used to beat Carl really bad when he was a teenager, sometimes with a belt, sometimes with his fists. But Carl would also step in when their dad turned on Naomi, taking the worst of it to protect her. She felt so guilty pursuing these charges knowing their dad wasn't innocent either, even though she knew Carl killed him. She kept crying, saying maybe Carl had reasons even if what he did was wrong. I started writing everything down in a notebook that night. Not just the facts, but how scared I was all the time now. I wrote about checking my locks 3 times before bed and looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. I wrote about choosing to pursue justice even when everyone in this situation had done terrible things to each other. I wrote about how being a witness was destroying my normal life piece by piece. Detective Hardy asked Darla Palmer to come back in and clarify some parts of her original statement. She said looking back, the father's eye movements seemed really purposeful, like he was tracking Carl specifically when he walked around the room. She believed he was trying to communicate warnings to us, but knew the defense would say it was just involuntary muscle movements. The most important thing Hardy found was in Carl's text messages from the morning his father died. He'd sent a message to someone at 8 that morning saying, "I'll make them feel it today," which could mean anything, but sounded threatening when you knew what happened later. 2 days later, Hamilton Pope called me into his office at the courthouse and showed me the paperwork he was filing for obstruction of justice and witness intimidation charges against Carl. He pointed to the security footage from the hospice showing Carl yanking the call button from the wall, then the part where he threatened me about needing a bed next to his father. These lesser charges would let them hold Carl while they built the murder case, and I watched Pope's assistant walk the papers down to the judge's chambers for immediate signing. The arrest warrant was ready by noon, and Detective Hardy called to say they were heading to Carl's apartment with backup units, since he had that violent history. I asked if I could be there to identify him, and Hardy said I could wait in his unmarked car a block away for safety. Carl's apartment building was one of those new luxury high-rises downtown with a doorman and everything, and I watched 6 officers enter the lobby while Hardy stayed outside coordinating. 20 minutes passed before they brought Carl out in handcuffs, and he was playing the confused victim perfectly for all his neighbors who had gathered to watch. He kept asking what this was about, and saying there must be some mistake. But when they walked him past Hardy's car, he turned and stared right at me through the window. His eyes were completely dead like that day in the hospice, and he mouthed something I couldn't make out before they pushed his head down to get him into the patrol car. The bail hearing happened 3 days later, and Delaney Reed showed up in a power suit arguing that Carl posed no danger to anyone and wasn't a flight risk. She painted him as a grieving son being persecuted by a family trying to find someone to blame for their natural loss, and the judge actually looked sympathetic. The prosecutor argued about the witness intimidation, but Delaney said I had misunderstood Carl's words during an emotional moment. The judge set bail at $50,000 with conditions including no contact with any witnesses, and Carl walked out that afternoon after posting bond. The victim's advocate met with me the next morning to create a safety plan since Carl was back on the streets. We mapped out different routes I could take to work and grocery shopping, installed new locks on my apartment door, and she gave me a camera system that would alert my phone if anyone approached. I had to set up check-in times with 3 different friends throughout each day, texting them a code word to confirm I was safe. The fear was exhausting, but having concrete steps to follow made me feel less helpless than just waiting for something bad to happen. A week later, the forensic document examiner finished analyzing the notepad and confirmed the handwriting matched samples of the father's writing from before his stroke. She explained how the shaky letters were consistent with someone fighting through motor impairment to communicate, not random movements or someone else guiding the hand. The pressure patterns showed genuine effort from the writer, and she documented everything in a detailed report with comparison photos. Delaney Reed scheduled my deposition 2 weeks after that, and I had to sit across from her in a conference room for 3 hours while she picked apart every second of that day. She suggested I had guided the father's hand myself, or maybe interpreted random muscle spasms as intentional writing. She made me describe over and over exactly how I held his hand, what angle the pen was at, how much pressure I applied. I stuck to my story because it was the truth, but she kept trying different angles to make me doubt what I saw. Carl getting out on bail after everything makes me really curious about what connections he might have. 50,000 posted that same afternoon for someone who threatened witnesses. That judge seemed awfully quick to buy the grieving son story despite the evidence. She even suggested I wanted attention, or was trying to help Naomi get inheritance money, which made me so mad I had to take a break to calm down. Financial records came out showing Naomi would inherit everything from her father, about $200,000 after all his debts were paid. Delaney leaked this to some true crime blogger who posted that maybe Naomi had motive too, and suddenly people online were harassing her with messages saying she killed her own father for money. She had to make her social media accounts private and change her phone number because of all the threats and accusations. One night, Naomi came to my apartment crying and admitted she had prevented Carl from seeing their father 6 months earlier when he tried to reconcile. Their dad had actually wanted to see Carl, but Naomi was too scared of what might happen, so she told Carl their father didn't want him there. She kept saying maybe if she had let them meet then, Carl wouldn't have been so angry and none of this would have happened. She was drowning in guilt, wondering if she had contributed to pushing Carl over the edge. Dr. Aurora finally finished her complete autopsy report and called us in to go over the findings. She concluded that insulin overdose was the cause of death with the manner being homicide, though she had to note the father's multiple health issues in her report. The defense would definitely use his bad health to argue reasonable doubt, but Aurora said the science supported murder charges, even if conviction wasn't guaranteed. Hamilton Pope reviewed everything and made the decision to file second-degree murder charges against Carl, calling us into his office to explain the risks. He warned that juries are really reluctant to convict in hospice deaths because they think the person was dying anyway and our case wasn't completely airtight. We sat there absorbing the reality that Carl might actually walk free even with all this evidence, but Pope said we had to try. I looked at Naomi and we both nodded, knowing this fight was going to get worse before it got better, if it ever got better at all. The crash team worked on him for 20 minutes while I clutched the notepad against my chest, Carl performing perfect grief beside me. When they finally called time of death, I slipped the paper into my pocket before anyone noticed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Carl turned to Naomi with tears streaming down his face, pulling her into a crushing hug that made her whole body go rigid. At least we were both here when Dad passed, he said loudly enough for the nurses to hear, and I saw Naomi's eyes go wide with panic over his shoulder. The hospice director arrived to handle paperwork, and Carl immediately took charge, signing forms and making decisions while Naomi sat frozen in shock. I texted her asking if she wanted to step outside, but she shook her head slightly, too afraid to leave Carl alone with any officials. In the parking lot afterward, Naomi broke down completely, begging me not to go to the police yet because she needed time to think. I showed her the notepad again, and she stared at her father's shaky handwriting, torn between believing it and wanting it to be wrong. That evening at my apartment, I couldn't stop checking my locks and windows, knowing Carl saw me at the hospice. I finally called the police non-emergency line and asked to speak with someone about a suspicious death, my voice barely above a whisper. Detective Hardy arrived within an hour, a calm, older man who took the notepad carefully with gloved hands. He asked detailed questions about everything I witnessed, writing notes about Carl yanking the call button and the father's obvious terror. 3 weeks passed before the preliminary hearing started, and by then the whole town had picked sides. Some people posted online that Carl was framed by money-hungry relatives, while others said the father's note proved everything. I stopped reading comments completely and only listened to what Hardy told me about the case. The courtroom was packed when arguments began over whether the father's note qualified as a dying declaration. Delaney stood up and argued the old man was confused from medication and couldn't possibly know what he was writing. Pope countered that the father clearly knew he was dying when he wrote those words with his last bit of strength. Darla took the stand first, describing how the father's grip on Naomi's wrist was way too strong for someone supposedly paralyzed. She explained how his eyes tracked Carl specifically around the room, not random movement but purposeful watching. Delaney challenged every detail, asking if muscle spasms could explain the grip strength and whether the eye movements were just coincidence. Darla held firm, repeating that in 15 years of hospice work she'd never seen anything like it. When my turn came to testify, my voice shook as I described helping the father write the note. Delaney grilled me about whether I guided his hand or interpreted random scratches as letters. She suggested I wanted attention, or was helping Naomi get inheritance money, which made me so mad I had to pause and breathe. I stuck to exactly what happened because it was the truth, even when she tried different angles to make me doubt myself. Aurora took the stand next with her autopsy findings, explaining how the insulin levels in the eye fluid pointed to overdose. She was careful to acknowledge that end-stage organ failure could sometimes cause similar readings, refusing to overstate her conclusions. Delaney pressed her on the limitations of the testing, but Aurora stayed professional and precise with every answer. The judge took 3 days to decide, finally ruling the note was admissible as a dying declaration. She cautioned that the jury would determine what weight to give it, but at least it would be part of the evidence. Delaney immediately filed an appeal, but the judge denied a stay pending review. Naomi's testimony was the hardest to watch because Delaney brought up their whole childhood. She made Naomi describe how their father beat Carl with a belt when he was 14, how Carl protected her from the worst of it. Naomi was crying so hard she could barely speak, admitting their family was broken long before this happened. The courtroom saw Carl as both victim and monster, which was exactly what Delaney wanted. 2 months into the proceedings, Carl violated the no-contact order by driving past Naomi's house 3 times in one day. A neighbor caught it on their doorbell camera and called the police immediately. The judge revoked his bail and Carl spent a week in county jail before his lawyer got him out on increased bond with an ankle monitor. The months of waiting that followed were filled with motion hearings and delays while both sides prepared for trial. I started getting migraines from the stress and couldn't sleep without checking my door locks multiple times. My therapist helped me work through the trauma, teaching me breathing exercises to use when the panic hit. Pope called us into his office 6 months after the father died with news about a plea deal. Carl would plead to manslaughter and witness intimidation, serving 12 years with possibility of parole in 8. It wasn't murder conviction, but it guaranteed he'd go to prison instead of risking acquittal at trial. Naomi and I sat in Pope's office for 3 hours going over every possible outcome while he showed us conviction statistics for similar cases. She kept twisting her dad's watch around her wrist, the one she'd taken from his bedside table after he died, and I watched her face change as Pope explained that juries sometimes let killers walk free when the victim was already dying. He pulled out a whiteboard and drew 2 columns, one showing guaranteed prison time with the plea versus the other showing either life in prison or complete acquittal if we went to trial. Naomi's hands were shaking so bad she couldn't hold the coffee cup steady, and Pope had to help her set it down on his desk before it spilled everywhere. I kept thinking about Carl's dead eyes in that hospice room and how he'd crushed his father's hand while smiling, and the idea of him walking free made my stomach turn. Pope left us alone in his office to talk it through, and Naomi broke down completely, saying she couldn't handle seeing Carl's face every day during a trial that might last months. We called Pope back in and told him to take the deal. 2 weeks later, we were back in court where Carl stood in his orange jumpsuit maintaining his innocence while admitting the evidence could convict him, which is what an Alford plea means. The judge asked him if he understood he was accepting 12 years with possibility of parole in 8, and Carl just nodded without any emotion on his face at all. Naomi grabbed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers when they led Carl away in shackles. 6 months passed before I saw Naomi again, and she looked different, calmer somehow. When she met me at her therapist's office to show me the progress she'd made, she'd kept her father's house but had contractors install new locks on every door and window, plus security cameras that recorded to the cloud 24 hours a day. The therapist helped her work through survivor's guilt about not protecting her father better, and Naomi showed me the journal where she wrote letters to him every night. She'd found boxes of old photos in the attic showing Carl as a little boy before everything went wrong, and she couldn't bring herself to throw them away, even though looking at them made her sick. I still checked my locks 3 times before bed and parked under the brightest lights in every parking lot, sending my location to my roommate whenever I went anywhere alone. The panic attacks had gotten better, but I still jumped whenever someone walked up behind me, and my therapist said that might never completely go away. This plea deal situation feels really calculated. 12 years with parole in 8 for killing someone seems light, but Pope's breakdown of jury statistics clearly got to Naomi. Makes me curious why Carl would take an Alford plea if he's maintaining innocence. That's basically admitting guilt without actually admitting it. Darla Palmer contacted me about testifying to a state review board about hospice security, and we spent 4 hours in a conference room going over every detail of that day. She showed them the exact spot where Carl yanked the call button from the wall and demonstrated how visitors could block staff from reaching patients. The board voted to require panic buttons that couldn't be disconnected and mandated that high-risk visitors be supervised by security. Small changes that felt huge to us. Zara Aurora sent me a copy of the medical journal where she'd published our case without using real names, explaining how insulin murders in hospice settings often went undetected because doctors assumed natural death. She'd developed a new protocol for testing eye fluid in suspicious hospice deaths deaths that 3 other states had already adopted, turning our nightmare into something that might save other families. The final sentencing hearing came 8 months after the plea, where victim impact statements would be read before Carl got formally sentenced. I sat in the back row watching Carl scan the courtroom until his eyes found me, and he held that stare for 10 long seconds before I looked down at my hands instead. The judge gave him the full 12 years and ordered him to pay restitution to Naomi for the funeral costs, though we knew he'd never pay a cent of it. Afterwards, Naomi and I went to the coffee shop on 3rd Street where her dad used to take her for hot chocolate when she was little. We talked about her new job at the library and my decision to go back to the school for social work, normal stuff that had nothing to do with Carl or trials or fear. She still wore her father's watch, and I still looked over my shoulder more than I should, but we'd found a way to keep living despite everything. The coffee shop played old jazz music that reminded Naomi of Sunday mornings with her dad before Carl went to prison the first time, and she smiled when she talked about those memories now. Some wounds don't completely heal, and some questions never get answered, but sitting there with Naomi, both of us changed but not broken, felt like the best ending we could hope for. Thanks for hanging out and wondering about all these questions with me today. It's always interesting seeing where curiosity takes us. Until next time. And hey, like the video. It helps more than you think.